In the summer of 1978, the United States Department of Defense conducted a large-scale readiness exercise known as Operation Nifty Nugget, designed to test the nation's ability to mobilize, deploy, and sustain forces in the event of a major conflict in Europe, and what began as a command post simulation intended to validate existing war plans instead revealed structural weaknesses across multiple layers of the American mobilization system, exposing deficiencies in reserve activation procedures, transportation coordination, port capacity, data management, and interagency communication that raised fundamental questions about whether the United States could meet its NATO reinforcement commitments within the timelines assumed by alliance planners. Because by the late 1970s, U.S. strategy for defending Western Europe rested heavily on the rapid deployment of reinforcements from the continental United States under plans such as the General Defense Plan and the emerging Reforger framework, which envisioned flying personnel across the Atlantic to marry up with prepositioned equipment in Europe, while additional units and sustainment supplies moved by sealift. Yet this concept depended on a complex chain of mobilization steps, beginning with the notification of reserve units, the processing of individual service members through personnel centers, the allocation of aircraft and ships for strategic lift, and the coordinated movement of equipment from depots to ports of embarkation. And Operation Nifty Nugget was structured to test these mechanisms under simulated crisis conditions without prior warning to many participants, thereby measuring real response times rather than scripted performance. And almost immediately, the exercise exposed fragmentation within mobilization data systems, as personnel rosters for reserve units were found to be outdated or inconsistent across databases, leading to confusion about which individuals were available, medically qualified, or properly assigned, while automated systems intended to generate deployment manifests struggled with incompatible formats and incomplete records, delaying the issuance of orders and undermining confidence in manpower accounting. And these administrative shortcomings cascaded into transportation planning, because without accurate unit strength figures, it became difficult to determine aircraft seating requirements, cargo weight, and equipment volume. And when planners attempted to schedule airlift and sealift assets, they encountered further complications in the form of limited ready reserve fleet availability, port congestion forecasts, and insufficient coordination between military traffic management commands and civilian transportation authorities responsible for rail and trucking networks feeding major embarkation points, revealing that peacetime assumptions about port throughput, measured in short tons per day, did not fully account for simultaneous surges across multiple service components. And at key East Coast ports, simulations demonstrated that staging areas would likely become saturated with vehicles and containers awaiting loading, creating bottlenecks that could extend deployment timelines beyond the windows assumed in NATO contingency planning. While in parallel, the exercise identified gaps in the activation and processing capacity of reserve training centers, where the sudden influx of mobilized personnel exceeded administrative staffing levels and strained housing, medical screening, and equipment issue procedures, prolonging the time required to transition reservists from civilian status to deployable units. And these delays had strategic implications because Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid force concentration in the opening days of a European conflict, meaning that any slippage in U.S. mobilization timelines could alter the balance of power during the critical early phase. And as Nifty Nugget progressed through its simulated scenario, interagency coordination, challenges surfaced between the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, and other federal entities responsible for maritime assets, highlighting ambiguities in authority over commercial shipping requisition and the allocation of rail capacity to military cargo, with communication breakdowns demonstrating that crisis procedures had not been fully rehearsed under realistic stress conditions, and data flows between commands were frequently slowed by reliance on manual reporting and incompatible computer systems that could not easily share updated status information, forcing planners to rely on phone calls and fragmented situational awareness to reconstruct deployment progress. And at the operational level, the exercise further revealed that certain prepositioned equipment sets in Europe required maintenance or lacked complete documentation, raising concerns about the assumption that airlifted personnel could immediately draw fully mission-capable vehicles and weapons upon arrival, while sealift schedules indicated that heavy units dependent on maritime transport would arrive later than projected, potentially creating a staggered reinforcement pattern that left gaps in force posture. And by the conclusion of Operation Nifty Nugget, senior defense officials recognized that the weaknesses uncovered were not minor procedural glitches, but systemic vulnerabilities rooted in years of underinvestment in mobilization infrastructure, fragmented data architecture, and insufficient large-scale rehearsal of full-spectrum deployment under compressed timelines, and subsequent assessments emphasize the need for improved automated personnel systems, expanded ready reserve fleet capacity, enhanced port infrastructure, and clearer lines of interagency authority to ensure that in a real crisis, the United States could generate and project combat power at the scale required to meet its NATO obligations, making Nifty Nugget a pivotal moment in late Cold War defense planning, because it translated abstract mobilization concepts into measurable performance data, revealing the gap between planning assumptions and operational reality at a time when alliance credibility depended on the ability to reinforce Europe rapidly and reliably. As detailed after-action reviews were compiled in the months following Operation Nifty Nugget, the depth of the mobilization deficiencies became clearer, because what had initially appeared as administrative friction revealed structural weaknesses embedded in the way the United States organized reserve forces, managed transportation assets, and integrated data systems across commands. And one of the most significant findings involved the fragmentation of personnel accountability within the reserve components, where outdated paper records, inconsistent computer databases, and incomplete readiness tracking combined to produce uncertainty about actual deployable strength, with simulations showing that notification cascades did not reach all assigned individuals within projected timeframes, and that medical and administrative screening created additional attrition not reflected in planning figures, thereby reducing effective unit strength below assumed levels during the crucial early days of mobilization. And this gap forced planners to confront the reality that mobilization models built on theoretical end strength did not adequately account for real-world absenteeism, administrative delay, and processing capacity limits at mobilization stations, which themselves were shown to be constrained by insufficient staffing and infrastructure to handle simultaneous activation of multiple units, resulting in processing backlogs measured in days rather than hours. And beyond personnel activation, the exercise exposed severe weaknesses in transportation coordination, particularly in the sequencing of cargo movement from continental depots to ports of embarkation, where the Military Traffic Management Command struggled to reconcile competing demands for rail cars, trucking contracts, and staging space under conditions of simulated crisis, revealing that peacetime commercial freight commitments and limited rail surge capacity could significantly restrict military throughput, while port readiness assessments indicated that loading plans underestimated the complexity of assembling unit equipment into coherent shiploads, with mismatches between cargo arriving at docks and vessel availability, producing idle time that compounded schedule slippage. And sealift shortfalls were particularly concerning, because the ready reserve fleet, composed largely of older vessels maintained in reduced operating status, required activation procedures that extended beyond the ideal timelines envisioned in NATO reinforcement scenarios. And mechanical readiness issues combined with crewing challenges underscored the vulnerability of relying on aging maritime assets to deliver heavy divisions across the Atlantic within compressed windows and airlift capacity, though more responsive, was also constrained by aircraft availability and airfield throughput limits, especially when measured against the simultaneous requirement to support global commitments beyond Europe, forcing planners to recognize that strategic lift was a finite resource subject to prioritization conflicts. And Nifty Nugget further illuminated deficiencies in command and control integration, as data exchanges between the Joint Chiefs of Staff, U.S.-European Command, transportation commands, and service component headquarters were hampered by incompatible information systems that could not generate a unified real-time deployment picture, leading to discrepancies in reported arrival times and force availability projections that complicated coordination with NATO counterparts. And this fragmentation raised broader questions about the reliability of war plans that assumed precise synchronization between U.S. reinforcement and forward, deployed Allied forces, because without accurate visibility into mobilization, Progress Alliance planners could not confidently calibrate defensive operations against expected American arrival. And the implications extended to prepositioned equipment in Europe, where inspection during the exercise revealed maintenance gaps and documentation inconsistencies that might delay issue to arriving personnel, highlighting that the success of the reforger concept depended not only on rapid airlift, but on the sustained upkeep of stored materiel. And in response to these findings, senior defense officials initiated a series of corrective measures aimed at modernizing personnel databases, expanding strategic sealift through procurement and improved maintenance of reserve vessels, investing in port infrastructure upgrades to increase throughput measured in short tons per day, and developing more integrated command and control systems capable of providing accurate deployment tracking under crisis conditions, while additional large-scale exercises were scheduled to retest improvements and ensure that mobilization timelines aligned more closely with NATO's reinforcement requirements. And thus Operation Nifty Nugget became a catalyst for late Cold War mobilization reform, forcing the Department of Defense to reconcile planning assumptions with empirical performance data and underscoring that deterrence credibility depended not only on force structure and doctrine, but on the measurable ability to activate, move, and sustain those forces within the narrow timeframes dictated by potential conflict in Europe. In the years immediately following Operation Nifty Nugget, the Department of Defense undertook a comprehensive reassessment of mobilization doctrine and infrastructure, recognizing that the weaknesses exposed in 1978 were not isolated anomalies, but symptoms of a system that had not been fully stress-tested since the height of earlier Cold War crises, and one of the central areas of reform focused on personnel readiness accounting, where the fragmentation between active duty databases, reserve component records, and mobilization station processing systems had produced inconsistent force availability projections, leading to the development and expansion of integrated personnel management systems designed to provide real-time visibility into individual readiness status, medical qualification, and assignment alignment, thereby reducing the gap between authorized strength and deployable strength during activation. And these improvements were accompanied by increased funding for reserve training and administrative staffing to accelerate processing capacity at mobilization centers, because Nifty Nugget had demonstrated that administrative throughput could become a decisive bottleneck when multiple units were activated simultaneously, and parallel reforms targeted strategic lift capacity, particularly sealift, as analyses revealed that reliance on an aging, ready reserve fleet posed unacceptable risk to reinforcement timelines assumed in NATO contingency plans, prompting accelerated programs to recapitalize and modernize maritime assets, expand roll-on-roll-off capability for heavy equipment transport, and streamline activation procedures to reduce the time required to bring reserve vessels to operational status, while port infrastructure upgrades were initiated to increase staging capacity, improve cargo marshaling efficiency, and expand berthing availability so that projected throughput measured in tons per day more closely matched war plan requirements. And at the same time, airlift planning was refined to better allocate limited aircraft resources between theaters, incorporating more realistic sortie generation assumptions and improved scheduling coordination between military airlift command and theater commanders, ensuring that personnel movements to Europe would not outpace the availability of equipment or sustainment supplies. And another significant outcome of Nifty Nugget was the recognition that interagency coordination required clearer authority structures and rehearsed communication channels, leading to formalized agreements between the Department of Defense and the Department of Transportation regarding access to commercial shipping, rail prioritization, and crisis traffic management procedures, with subsequent exercises explicitly designed to test these coordination mechanisms under compressed timelines. And improvements were also directed toward the maintenance and accountability of prepositioned equipment sets in Europe, as inspections conducted after the exercise highlighted discrepancies that could delay issue to arriving units, prompting enhanced oversight, standardized maintenance reporting, and stricter documentation controls to ensure that airlifted personnel could assume operational control of equipment without administrative delay. And by the early 1980s, these reforms were being incorporated into successive iterations of the reforger exercises, which increasingly emphasize not only the physical movement of forces, but the synchronization of personnel, equipment, and sustainment flows under realistic mobilization conditions, providing empirical validation of corrective measures implemented after 1978. And as NATO planners observed improvements in U.S. deployment timelines and data transparency, confidence in reinforcement credibility was gradually restored. Though analysts continued to emphasize that mobilization remained a complex system vulnerable to disruption, if not continuously exercised and updated, and thus Operation Nifty Nugget assumed enduring significance within late Cold War defense planning as the moment when theoretical mobilization constructs were confronted with operational friction, compelling the United States to modernize its personnel systems, expand its sealift capacity, upgrade its port infrastructure, and refine its interagency coordination processes in order to align practical performance with the strategic commitments embedded in alliance war plans, reinforcing the broader lesson that deterrence credibility depended not solely on declared force strength, but on the measurable capacity to activate and project that strength within the narrow timelines dictated by potential conflict in Europe. As reforms initiated after Operation Nifty Nugget began to take effect in the early to mid-1980s, the Department of Defense increasingly integrated mobilization readiness metrics into formal strategic planning documents, ensuring that force deployment timelines were grounded in validated transportation capacity rather than optimistic projections. And one of the most consequential adjustments involved recalibrating reinforcement assumptions within NATO's General Defense Plan, where U.S. arrival schedules were revised to reflect empirically tested activation and transit intervals measured during post-Nugget exercises, reducing the risk that alliance defensive schemes would depend on forces that could not realistically reach the theater within the first critical days, and transportation modeling became more sophisticated, incorporating port throughput simulations based on expanded staging areas and improved cargo sequencing procedures, with planners calculating vessel turnaround time in hours, rail feed capacity in rail cars per day, and loading rates in short tons per crane per hour to ensure that sealift operations could sustain continuous flow without backlog accumulation, and parallel improvements in the ready reserve fleet activation cycle reduced estimated time to full operational status for key roll-on roll-off vessels, addressing one of the most serious vulnerabilities identified in 1978, when mechanical readiness and crew mobilization had extended deployment timelines beyond acceptable limits. And at the personnel level, integrated data systems provided more accurate accountability of reservists, including readiness, categorization, and medical qualification tracking, enabling more precise forecasting of effective unit strength upon activation, while mobilization station infrastructure was expanded in certain regions to increase processing throughput measured in personnel per day, mitigating the administrative bottlenecks that had previously delayed force assembly. And command and control systems also benefited from technological modernization, as improved communications networks and computerized tracking tools enhanced the ability of joint headquarters to maintain a unified deployment picture, reducing discrepancies between reported and actual force movement status, and improving coordination with U.S. European Command and NATO counterparts. And successive reforger iterations served as validation events in which mobilization data, accuracy, lift scheduling synchronization, and equipment draw procedures were tested against revised standards, producing measurable improvements in deployment timelines. Compared to the performance observed during Nifty Nugget, though planners continued to identify stress points requiring attention, particularly in the integration of commercial transportation assets under crisis conditions, where legal authority and contractual clarity remained critical to rapid requisition, and the broader strategic effect of these reforms was to narrow the gap between U.S. mobilization capability and the compressed concentration timelines associated with Warsaw Pact doctrine, reinforcing alliance confidence that American reinforcement would arrive within windows sufficient to influence early phase balance. And by the latter half of the 1980s, mobilization readiness had become an institutionalized performance category subject to periodic audit and exercise, rather than an abstract assumption embedded in war plans, illustrating how a single large-scale readiness test had reshaped defense management priorities across personnel administration, maritime procurement, port, engineering, and interagency coordination. And as Cold War tensions evolved through renewed confrontation and eventual political transformation in Eastern Europe, the mobilization architecture refined in the wake of Operation Nifty Nugget provided the United States with a more credible capacity to translate strategic commitment into measurable deployment performance, ensuring that reinforcement of Europe was supported not only by doctrine, but by tested and modernized logistical systems capable of sustaining high-tempo movement under crisis conditions. By the late 1980s, Operation Nifty Nugget had come to be viewed within defense planning circles not simply as a failed readiness drill, but as a structural turning point in how the United States conceptualized large-scale mobilization for continental war, because it forced senior leadership to confront the reality that post-Vietnam reductions, bureaucratic compartmentalization, and underinvestment in transportation infrastructure had created a widening gap between NATO reinforcement theory and executable deployment performance. And in response, the Department of Defense institutionalized a more rigorous mobilization validation culture, in which assumptions about reserve activation rates, sealift activation timelines, port discharge capacity, and rail onward movement were continuously measured against exercise data rather than accepted on historical precedent. And one of the most consequential outcomes was the expansion and modernization of strategic sealift, including procurement of additional roll-on-roll-off vessels designed specifically to carry heavy armored formations, thereby increasing total lift capacity measured in square feet of vehicle deck space, and reducing reliance on aging ships whose activation delays had alarmed planners during Nifty Nugget. And improvements in port engineering also translated into higher sustainable throughput, with investments in additional staging acreage, improved cargo, marshalling layouts, and upgraded crane systems, allowing planners to project increased loading rates in short tons per hour under surge conditions, while integration with rail networks feeding embarkation ports was strengthened through prearranged priority agreements and clearer legal authority for military traffic precedents during declared emergencies. And at the personnel level, expanded automation reduced discrepancies between authorized and available strength, enabling more accurate forecasting of deployable manpower within defined mobilization phases. And these reforms collectively reduced projected deployment timelines for certain heavy divisions and support units compared to 1978 baselines, though planners remained cautious about declaring mobilization fully optimized, recognizing that the system's complexity meant vulnerabilities could re-emerge if not continuously exercised. And within NATO, the improved transparency of U.S. mobilization data enhanced alliance planning, confidence, allowing more precise synchronization between American arrival and forward-deployed European forces, thereby strengthening deterrence credibility during a period marked by renewed East-West tension over intermediate-range missile deployments and high-intensity exercise cycles on both sides of the inner German border. And although the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically after 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and subsequent political transformation in Eastern Europe, the mobilization reforms initiated in response to Operation Nifty Nugget left a lasting institutional imprint, embedding transportation capacity analysis, reserve accountability accuracy, and interagency coordination clarity into the core of U.S. defense management practice. And in retrospect, the exercise demonstrated that mobilization strength was not measured solely in divisions on paper, but in the quantifiable ability to activate personnel, load equipment, secure maritime lift, process port, traffic, and deliver combat power across oceans within compressed timelines defined by adversary doctrine. A realization that reshaped late Cold War planning by aligning strategic commitments with empirically tested logistical capacity and reinforcing the principle that credible reinforcement depended on measurable readiness rather than declaratory policy alone. The broader strategic significance of Operation Nifty Nugget lay in the way it altered the relationship between planning assumptions and measurable execution across the entire mobilization enterprise. Because prior to 1978, many reinforcement timelines embedded in NATO defense concepts were derived from theoretical activation curves and peacetime transportation estimates rather than from full system stress testing. And Nifty Nugget exposed that gap by simulating simultaneous reserve call-ups, port surges, airlift scheduling conflicts, and sealift activation under compressed timelines, revealing that cumulative friction across multiple nodes could expand deployment windows beyond the thresholds assumed in alliance war plans, and the corrective actions that followed reflected a recognition that mobilization had to be treated as an integrated system in which personnel databases, transportation assets, infrastructure capacity, and command and control architecture were interdependent variables rather than isolated functions, leading to the establishment of more rigorous deployment modeling tools that incorporated empirically derived activation rates, verified ship readiness cycles, and validated port throughput metrics expressed in measurable units such as vehicles per day and short tons per hour, and these models were subsequently incorporated into iterative reforger exercises and joint readiness reviews, providing recurring feedback loops that allowed planners to refine force flow sequencing and reduce mismatches between personnel arrival and equipment availability. And as improvements in sealift, recapitalization increased available roll-on roll-off deck space and reduced time to readiness for reserve vessels. Projected heavy unit arrival schedules narrowed, strengthening the credibility of U.S. commitments to reinforce Europe during the first weeks of conflict, while modernization of mobilization station infrastructure improved personnel processing throughput and reduced administrative lag, addressing one of the most acute bottlenecks identified during the 1978 simulation, and enhancements in interagency coordination protocols clarified authority over commercial transportation, requisition and rail prioritization, reducing ambiguity that had previously slowed cargo movement toward embarkation ports, and collectively these reforms translated into more resilient reinforcement architecture by the mid to late 1980s, at a time when Warsaw Pact operational doctrine still emphasized rapid massing along the Central Front, thereby reducing the strategic asymmetry that Nifty Nugget had initially revealed. And although the geopolitical transformation of 1989 to 1991 diminished the immediate likelihood of large-scale European conflict, the mobilization reforms triggered by the exercise remained embedded in U.S. defense planning, influencing subsequent contingency frameworks and reinforcing the institutional lesson that deterrence credibility depends on validated logistical performance rather than nominal force strength. And thus, Operation Nifty Nugget stands within the Cold War narrative as a diagnostic event that forced alignment between strategic commitment and operational capacity, compelling modernization across personnel management, maritime procurement, port engineering, and command integration, so that the United States could realistically generate and project combat power at the scale and speed required by its alliance obligations. When evaluated in the full context of late Cold War defense planning, Operation Nifty Nugget represented a rare moment in which the E-key United States subjected its own mobilization architecture to an unscripted systems-level stress test and discovered that the distance between strategic promise and logistical execution was wider than previously acknowledged, because the exercise demonstrated that reserve activation delays, fragmented personnel databases, limited sealift readiness, constrained port throughput, and incomplete interagency coordination could collectively erode reinforcement timelines that NATO planning assumed were fixed. And this realization reshaped the institutional approach to readiness by embedding measurable mobilization performance into force planning rather than treating deployment speed as an abstract assumption. And the reforms that followed, including expansion of roll-on roll-off sealift capacity, modernization of ready reserve activation procedures, investment in port staging and cargo handling infrastructure, integration of automated personnel accountability systems, and clarification of crisis authority over commercial transportation networks, narrowed the gap between projected and validated deployment capability, allowing reinforcement models to be recalculated on the basis of empirically tested activation curves and throughput data rather than optimistic estimates. And by the mid to late 1980s, successive exercises indicated measurable improvement in personnel processing rates, vessel activation timelines, and port loading efficiency compared to 1978 benchmarks, strengthening confidence that U.S. heavy divisions and support units could be delivered to Europe within timeframes consistent with NATO defensive concepts. And although the political transformation of Eastern Europe after 1989 reduced the immediate probability of large-scale continental war, the mobilization architecture refined in the wake of Nifty Nugget remained embedded in defense planning structures, reinforcing the broader Cold War lesson that deterrence credibility depends not solely on the existence, of forces on paper, but on the quantifiable capacity to activate, transport, and integrate those forces under crisis conditions defined by adversary doctrine. And in this sense, Operation Nifty Nugget exposed weaknesses that, once addressed, contributed to a more resilient reinforcement posture during the final decade of the East-West confrontation, aligning American strategic commitments with validated logistical performance and ensuring that the projection of combat power across the Atlantic was grounded in tested infrastructure, coordinated authority, and measurable throughput rather than assumption alone.